I was standing in my backyard, coffee still warm in my hand, enjoying a quiet morning when my phone buzzed. One email, one subject line, and just like that, my stomach dropped. Notice of encroachment on community property. I actually laughed out loud at first. I thought it had to be a joke or some kind of mix-up. This backyard had been mine since the day I signed the papers. I paid for the survey. I paid for the fence. I had the deed sitting in a folder inside my house. Then I kept reading. According to the HOA, my backyard, the same space where my kids learned to ride their bikes, where I planted fruit trees with my dad, where we spent countless weekends, was not mine at all. They claimed it was shared community property and accused me of illegally occupying it. They gave me 14 days to tear down my fence or face daily fines. What hit me hardest was the tone, confident, smug, like they already owned the place and I was just borrowing it by mistake. That was the moment I thought, you picked the wrong homeowner, because I had the paperwork, and I knew exactly how to use it. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I live in a quiet little place called Red Willow Ridge, a planned community just outside Harrison Creek, Missouri. On the surface, it looks like one of those neighborhoods real estate agents love to brag about. Neatly trimmed lawns, identical mailboxes lined up like soldiers, neighbors who wave politely but never linger too long. It is calm, predictable, and honestly, that is exactly what I wanted at the time. When I bought my house back in 2017, the HOA felt harmless, almost forgettable. The dues were low, the rules were basic, and everything seemed focused on keeping the neighborhood looking clean. Trash cans needed to be hidden after pickup day. Houses had approved paint colors, nothing unusual. Nothing aggressive? It felt more like background noise than actual authority. My backyard was one of the biggest reasons I chose that house. It was larger than most of the others on the block and backed up to a stretch of old oak trees that had clearly been there long before the neighborhood was built. It felt private, peaceful, like a small slice of land actually belonged to me. Before we even closed on the house, I paid extra for a full professional survey. I wanted zero surprises. The surveyor walked the entire property, placed the markers, and showed me exactly where my land began and ended. The lines were clear as day. Within the first month of moving in, I had a fence installed. Nothing fancy, just a solid, clean fence that followed the property lines shown on the survey. The HOA approved it without a single comment, no warnings, no objections, no letters. For years, everything stayed quiet. We used the backyard constantly. Family barbecues, kids running around. Late evenings sitting under the trees. Not once did anyone question whether that space was mine. Things only started to change when the HOA board changed. A new group took over, led by a woman named Linda Crowley. From the very beginning, Linda had a reputation. She liked rules. But more than that, she liked enforcing them. Suddenly, the HOA was everywhere. Notices started popping up for things that had never mattered before. Grass was now measured instead of glanced at. Holiday decorations had strict timelines. Someone even got a warning for having the wrong type of patio furniture visible from the street. It felt like the neighborhood went from relaxed to tense almost overnight. At first, I stayed out of it. None of the new rules really affected me, and I figured it was just another phase that would blow over. I had no idea my backyard was already on their radar. One afternoon, Linda showed up at my door. She was holding a clipboard and wearing that tight, rehearsed smile people use when they are convinced they have the upper hand. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not make small talk. She got straight to the point. She said the board was reviewing old plats and had concerns that my fence might be in violation. I remember feeling confused more than anything. I calmly told her the fence followed my deeded property lines. I mentioned the professional survey. I even offered to show her the paperwork. She barely acknowledged any of it. Instead, she tapped her clipboard and said, "We will see about that." That was it. No explanation, no details. Just that vague little threat before she turned around and walked away. For the next couple of weeks, I kept waiting for some kind of follow-up. A letter, a request for documents, anything, but nothing came. Life went on. I started to think maybe it was all just talk. Then the email arrived. No warning, no conversation. Just a formal notice accusing me of illegally occupying community property and demanding I remove my fence. That was the moment everything shifted. What had started as a quiet, forgettable HOA suddenly became a serious problem. And even then, I had no idea how far they were willing to push it. I tried to handle it the polite way first. I really did. I emailed the HOA the same day I got the notice and kept my tone calm and professional. I attached everything I thought any reasonable person would need to see. A copy of my deed, the full professional survey with clearly marked property lines, even the original listing photos from when I bought the house, showing the backyard as part of the property. I figured once they saw the documentation, this whole thing would end as quickly as it started. Their response came 2 days later. It was 3 sentences long. They said their legal team had determined otherwise, that my fence was encroaching on community property, and that I needed to comply promptly. No explanation. No reference to the documents I sent. It felt less like a discussion and more like a command. That was when the fines started. At first, it was $50 a day. A notice appeared in my inbox like clockwork every morning. Then, without warning, it jumped to $100 a day. The language in the emails grew more aggressive. They started mentioning additional enforcement actions and possible lien placement on my home if I failed to comply. Seeing the word lien attached to the house I worked years to afford made my chest tighten. I decided the next HOA meeting would clear things up. Surely, face-to-face, logic would win. I walked into the clubhouse that evening with a folder full of paperwork under my arm, ready to calmly explain everything. Instead, I walked into a room where the outcome had already been decided. Linda was sitting at the front table with the rest of the board, flipping through papers like she was already bored of the issue. When my turn came to speak, she stood up, walked over to a large map taped to the wall, and pointed at my backyard. The map was blown up and marked with highlighter. She told the room that area had always been intended as a future community green space. I asked a simple question. If that was true, why had no one ever mentioned it in the years I had lived there? Why was it never disclosed when I bought the house? Why did the official survey show it as my property? Linda did not hesitate. She shrugged and said, "Mistakes happen." That answer sent a murmur through the room. A few neighbors looked at each other, clearly uncomfortable. I could feel my frustration rising, but I stayed calm and pointed out that a mistake like that would have shown up in county records. She cut me off before I could finish. Then she said the line that really got under my skin. "You should be grateful we are letting you use it this long." Letting me use it, as if they were doing me a favor. As if the backyard where my family spent years making memories was borrowed space. That was the moment I realized this was no longer about a misunderstanding. This was about control. I left that meeting shaking with anger. The fines were piling up. The board was refusing to listen. And Linda was clearly enjoying every second of it. That night, sitting at my kitchen table with documents spread out in front of me, my frustration finally turned into resolve. If they wanted paperwork, I was going to drown them in it. The next morning, I did not go to work. I did not answer HOA emails. I went straight to the county records office. If the HOA wanted to turn this into a paperwork fight, then I was going to make sure I had every official document on my side. I brought my deed, my survey, and a notebook filled with dates and notes from the past few weeks. The clerk at the records office was an older woman who had clearly seen her fair share of neighborhood disputes. When I explained what I was looking for, she nodded and pointed me toward the public terminals. I started pulling up records tied to my lot number, then the surrounding lots, then the original subdivision filings from when Red Willow Ridge was first built. That was when things got interesting. My deed was exactly as I knew it was. Clean. Clear. No shared ownership. No easements running through my backyard. No fine print giving the HOA any rights to that land. Then I pulled the original subdivision plat, the one recorded with the county before a single house was ever built. And there it was, plain as day. My backyard was part of my lot from the very beginning. It had never been labeled as community space. Not even temporarily. I kept digging. Buried in later documents, I found what the HOA was relying on, a so-called amendment that labeled several backyards as future community property. The problem was obvious the moment I read it closely. It was never approved by the county. There was no official stamp, no recording number, no legal signatures from property owners. In other words, it had no legal standing at all. It was just a piece of paper the HOA had been waving around and hoping no one would question. That realization hit me hard. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a clerical error. The HOA had been pretending they owned land they never legally controlled. Before I left, I decided to look up something else. Linda Crowley's property. If the board was suddenly obsessed with old plats, I wanted to see how her lot lined up. It did not take long. Her backyard fence crossed directly into a marked drainage easement, a real one. Clearly labeled, clearly restricted. The kind of violation that normally came with immediate enforcement. I sat there staring at the screen, feeling a strange mix of anger and clarity. Linda was accusing me of occupying land that was legally mine, while she was actively violating an actual easement. And she knew it. She had to know it. At that moment, everything shifted. This was no longer just about protecting my backyard. It was about exposing a board that was abusing its power and betting on homeowners being too intimidated to fight back. I printed every relevant document, organized them carefully, and walked out of that office knowing one thing for sure. They had no idea what was coming. I did not wait long after leaving the county records office. By the end of that week, I was sitting across from a real estate attorney named Mark Holloway. Mark was quiet, the kind of guy who listened more than he talked. He flipped through my documents slowly, page by page, without interrupting. When he finally looked up, he smiled. Not a friendly smile, but the kind that told me someone else had just made a very bad decision. He told me everything the HOA had claimed was built on sand. My deed was solid. The original plat was solid. That so-called amendment they were using had no legal authority at all. Mark said the fines were unlawful, the threats were reckless, and the board was exposing itself to serious liability. Hearing that felt like finally being able to breathe again. Mark drafted a formal response to the HOA that same afternoon. It was direct and impossible to ignore. He demanded they immediately stop all fines, retract their enforcement notices, and provide documented proof that they owned the land they were claiming. He also warned them that continued harassment would result in legal action. The letter went out certified, emailed, and copied to every board member. For a brief moment, I thought that would be the end of it. Any reasonable board would have backed off once lawyers got involved. Linda was not reasonable. Instead of responding through their own attorney, the HOA sent another notice. This one was labeled a special enforcement hearing. They scheduled it less than 2 weeks out and claimed my continued refusal to remove the fence constituted a serious violation. The letter went even further. It mentioned foreclosure as a possible consequence if I did not comply. Foreclosure over land they did not even own. When I read that word, my hands started shaking. It was one thing to be fined. It was another thing entirely to have someone threaten your home. But the fear did not last long. It turned into anger, cold, focused anger. Because at that moment, Linda and the board crossed a line they could not step back over. I forwarded the notice to Mark immediately. He called me within an hour. "This is their mistake," he said calmly. "A big one." Mark explained that threatening foreclosure without legal standing was not just unethical, it was dangerous. It opened the HOA up to claims of harassment, abuse of authority, and wrongful enforcement. He told me not to attend their so-called hearing. Instead, he would handle things the right way. That same day, Mark filed for an injunction. The paperwork moved fast. Faster than anything the HOA had done so far. The injunction requested an immediate court order to stop all fines, halt enforcement actions, and prevent the HOA from placing a lien or attempting foreclosure until the ownership dispute was resolved. Mark attached everything: the deed, the original plat, the invalid amendment, and a detailed timeline of the HOA's actions. When the court granted the temporary injunction, it felt surreal. Overnight, the power shifted. The HOA was legally barred from collecting another dollar from me. They could not fine me. They could not threaten me. They could not touch my property. Linda, however, did not take it well. She sent a late-night email accusing me of escalating unnecessarily and attacking the community. She claimed the board was being bullied. The irony would have been funny if it was not so infuriating. This was the same board that had threatened to take my house. Mark told me not to respond. "Let them talk," he said. "They are doing more damage every time they open their mouths." Word started spreading through the neighborhood. People noticed the fines stopped. Some neighbors quietly asked me what was going on. A few admitted they had received similar warnings in the past and just paid to avoid trouble. That realization hit me hard. This was bigger than me. The HOA thought intimidation would make me fold. They thought I would panic and tear down the fence. Instead, they handed everything to a judge. And they still did not realize how badly they had miscalculated. The hearing was nothing like the neat, controlled HOA meetings Linda was used to running. This time, it was held in a county courtroom, not a clubhouse, and the atmosphere was completely different. Neighbors filled the benches, whispering to one another, flipping through papers, clearly unsure why they were even there. Some looked angry, others looked nervous. A few looked relieved, like they were finally seeing someone stand up to the board. Linda sat at the front with the rest of the HOA representatives, stiff and tight-lipped. She was dressed like she always was for meetings, confident and polished, but something about her posture was off. The smug certainty she usually carried was missing. When the judge called the case, Mark stood up and calmly laid out the timeline. He explained how the HOA had claimed ownership of my backyard, how they issued fines, and how they escalated all the way to threatening foreclosure. He spoke slowly, clearly, and without emotion. Facts only. Dates. Documents. Every statement backed by evidence. Then he asked permission to display exhibits. The lights dimmed slightly, and Mark turned on the projector. The original subdivision plat appeared on the screen. Large, clear, undeniable. You could see every lot line, every boundary, exactly as it was recorded with the counting. My backyard was clearly part of my property. No shading. No footnotes. No mention of community space. The room went quiet. Mark walked the judge through it step by step, explaining how the HOA's claim relied on a later amendment that was never legally recorded. He showed the missing approvals, the lack of county stamps, the absence of required signatures. It was obvious to anyone watching that the document Linda had been relying on carried no legal weight. Linda shifted in her seat. Then Mark moved to the next exhibit. This time, the screen showed Linda Crowley's own property. The drainage easement was highlighted in bold lines. The judge leaned forward as Mark explained that Linda's backyard fence extended directly into the restricted area, a legitimate violation. one that had existed for years without enforcement. Linda shocked to her feet. She tried to interrupt, insisting it was irrelevant, that the issue was my fence, not hers. Her voice echoed through the courtroom, sharp and defensive. The judge did not let her finish. "Sit down," the judge said firmly. The room went even quieter than before. For the first time since this whole ordeal started, Linda looked unsure. Her face drained of color as the judge asked her if she was aware of the easement. She hesitated before answering, and that hesitation said everything. The judge reminded her that selectively enforcing rules was a serious issue, especially when paired with misrepresenting property ownership. I watched as the confidence completely left her. The woman who once told me I should be grateful now looked genuinely afraid. She kept glancing at the documents in front of her like they might suddenly change. As the hearing continued, neighbors whispered more openly now. I caught fragments of conversations. People realizing they might have been fined unfairly. People questioning past enforcement. The illusion of authority the HOA relied on was cracking in real time. When the judge adjourned the hearing to review the evidence, the tension in the room was thick. No one knew the final outcome yet, but one thing was clear. Linda was no longer in control. The ruling came faster than anyone expected. Less than a week after the hearing, Mark called me early in the morning. I could hear the smile in his voice before he even said hello. The judge had issued the decision, and it was decisive. The HOA had no legal claim to my backyard, none at all. The court ruled that the original subdivision plat controlled the property boundaries, and that the so-called amendment the HOA relied on was invalid and unenforceable. Because of that, every fine they issued against me was illegal from the start. But it did not stop there. The judge went further, addressing the HOA's pattern of behavior. The ruling stated that the board had acted beyond its authority and used threats of fines and foreclosure without legal standing. As a result, the HOA was ordered to refund every dollar they had collected related to similar violations. Not just from me, but from multiple homeowners who had been fined under the same false claims. When that news spread, the neighborhood exploded. People who had quietly paid fines for years suddenly realized they never should have. Neighbors who had been too scared to question the board started comparing notices and emails. The image of an all-powerful HOA crumbled almost overnight. What replaced it was anger. Anger at being intimidated. Anger at being lied to. Then came the part that even I did not fully expect. The judge specifically addressed Linda Crowley's conduct. The ruling stated that she knowingly misrepresented property ownership while serving as HOA president. That detail mattered. It meant this was not an honest mistake, it was deliberate. Because of that, she was personally fined and formally reprimanded by the court. Seeing her name singled out like that felt surreal. This was the same woman who told me I should be grateful for being allowed to use my own backyard. Now her actions were on record, in black and white, for everyone to see. The fallout was immediate. 2 days later, Linda resigned from the HOA board. No long email, no apology. Just a short notice sent to the community stating she was stepping down, effective immediately. People whispered that she was advised to resign. Others said she could not face the neighbors anymore. Whatever the reason, her grip on the neighborhood was gone. The remaining board members scrambled to contain the damage. Emergency meetings were scheduled. Refund checks started going out. The same people who once hid behind formal notices were suddenly careful, quiet, and overly polite. They knew they were under a microscope now. Neighbors stopped me in the street to thank me. Some admitted they had been scared to speak up before. Others said they thought the HOA was untouchable. Hearing that made everything click. This was never just about my fence. It was about a system that relied on fear and silence to operate. Standing in my backyard that evening, looking at the fence they tried so hard to tear down, I felt something I had not felt in months. Relief. Not just because I won, but because the truth finally mattered more than intimidation. The HOA's power came from people believing they had no choice. That belief was gone, and so was Linda. The weeks that followed felt like the neighborhood was slowly waking up from a long, uncomfortable dream. With Linda gone and the court ruling hanging over them, the HOA had no choice but to change. The board announced a full restructuring, starting with emergency elections and an outside management review. For the first time since I moved into Red Willow Ridge, everything was happening out in the open instead of behind closed doors. The new board looked nothing like the old one. Different faces. Different attitudes. The first thing they did was suspend several vague enforcement policies and admit, in writing, that mistakes had been made. That alone felt surreal. This was the same HOA that once threatened foreclosure without blinking. Now they were careful with every word. They invited homeowners to attend open forums. Not hearings, not disciplinary meetings. Actual conversations. People showed up in droves. Some came angry, some came cautious. Others came with stacks of old notices and fine receipts. For hours, stories poured out. Selective enforcement. Intimidating letters. Fines that never made sense. It became clear that what happened to me was not an isolated incident. I was just the one who pushed back hard enough to crack the system. One by one, refund checks started arriving in mailboxes. Not just mine, all over the neighborhood. Some were small amounts, others were hundreds of dollars. Every check was a quiet acknowledgement that the HOA had overstepped. Seeing those envelopes made people realize the board could be held accountable after all. As for my backyard, nothing changed, and that was the best part. The fence stayed exactly where it was. No more threats. No more emails. No more fines quietly stacking up overnight. The land was officially recognized as part of my property, just as it always had been. The HOA updated their records to match the county plat, and the issue was closed for good. Something else changed too. Neighbors started talking again. People lingered outside longer. Conversations happened across driveways and sidewalks. The tension that had crept into the community slowly faded. There was a shared understanding now. Everyone had seen what unchecked authority could do, and no one wanted to go back to that. The so-called community green space idea vanished without explanation. No announcement, no discussion. It simply stopped being mentioned. The amended documents that once claimed future ownership were quietly removed from the HOA website. It was as if the whole plan had never existed. Every now and then, someone would joke about it. A neighbor would glance at my backyard and say, "Looks like the nicest green space in the neighborhood." We would laugh, but there was truth behind the humor. That space was never about greenery. It was about control. Now, the rules were clear. The boundaries were respected, and the HOA finally understood that homeowners were not powerless. Red Willow Ridge was still neat and quiet, but it felt different in the best way possible. It felt like a neighborhood again. Looking back now, it still amazes me how close I came to losing something that was legally mine, all because someone assumed I would get scared, stay quiet, and roll over. That is the real lesson I took from all of this. HOAs only have as much power as homeowners allow them to take. When people stop asking questions, stop reading documents, and stop pushing back, that power grows unchecked. Paperwork matters. Facts matter. And standing your ground matters more than most people realize. That backyard is still the heart of our home. It is where birthdays are celebrated, where late-night conversations stretch under the stars, and where I start quiet mornings with a cup of coffee and a sense of peace. Nothing about that space feels borrowed anymore because I know exactly what it represents. It is proof that intimidation only works when you let it. I did not win because I was louder or angrier than the HOA. I won because I stayed calm, stayed patient, and let the truth do the heavy lifting. Knowledge shut them down faster than any argument ever could. If there is one thing I hope people take from this story, it is this. Do not assume you are powerless just because a letter sounds official. Ask questions, check the records, and do not be afraid to protect what is yours. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?